Mike Tyson. Okay, even if you're not a boxing fan, you almost certainly have heard that name, Mike Tyson. I think it's almost indisputable that Mike Tyson is the most famous boxer since Muhammad Ali, which would make him the second most famous boxer ever. He's sort of a personification of boxing itself. If a non-boxing fan wants to use an example of a boxer, the chances are they will use either Muhammad Ali or Mike Tyson as an example. So Tyson is in many ways a personification of the sport of boxing. He is incredibly famous, one of the most famous people in the world, probably, even today. So that's unquestionable. What I want to talk about a little bit in this video though is I want to question just how great Tyson was I should say, as a fighter. And I do ask you to listen to everything I have to say before rushing to judgment. First of all, I want to make it clear, I absolutely acknowledge that Tyson is an exceptional figure. He wielded immense power in his punches. He's certainly one of the hardest hitters ever in the sport. And his title of Kid Dynamite was well deserved, in the sense that he was incredibly fast, incredibly powerful. You sort of sense dynamite exploding. That's what Tyson was like. And it is true there was a period in the late 80s, from his defeat of over Trevor Berbick in 86 to his loss to James Buster Douglas in 1990, when it seemed that Tyson was almost unstoppable. However, it's not quite the case that every single guy he fought he stopped in the first or second round. There were a few guys there. I believe it was Tony Tucker went the distance with Tyson in those early days. So the idea that he was indestructible is slightly exaggerated, I think. Incredibly menacing, incredibly hard to challenge, and seemingly unstoppable, but I think that's a naive term to use for any fighter in any era. You have to remember, fighters are human beings. Every single boxer who ever entered a ring could potentially be at the end of an upset fight. So that's something that needs to be considered. And let's look at the guys he beat in those early days. One of his first major victories came over an aging Larry Holmes. That's a point that has to be considered. Larry Holmes was well past his peak at that point. He was an aging fighter. Larry Holmes is one of the greatest fighters who ever lived. So a lot of us made of the fact Tyson beat him, but the point is he was past his peak. If you're not a boxing fan, that just means basically past the time when the boxer is considered to be at his best, or her best. So a lot of guys that Tyson beat in that era, they were good fighters, and I don't want to disrespect or take anything away from them. You have guys like Michael Spinks, Pinklon Thomas, Tony Tubbs, Tony Tucker, Bone Crusher Smith. They're all good fighters, good contenders, some better than others. None of them were, I don't like the term bums anyway in boxing, but those guys were not bums, they were good fighters. And Tyson in most cases thoroughly dominated them. So he does deserve credit for that. And certainly in terms of achievement, to win the world heavyweight title at the age of 20 is a phenomenal achievement. Again, nothing should be taken away from that. But people forget that for most of Tyson's professional career, he was actually not that outstanding. Basically, after the Douglas fight in 1990, Tyson was a good heavyweight, possibly a great heavyweight, but I would argue not exceptionally great. And I want to point out a few facts to try and get through what I'm talking about. First of all is the obvious one, the loss to James Douglas in Tokyo. Now, Tyson fans always come out with excuses for that. They always say, oh, Tyson's head was in the wrong place, he was messing around with prostitutes the night before, he was on drugs, he wasn't feeling well, etc, etc, etc. I think this is slightly pushing it, because actually if you want to use that as an excuse, look at James Buster Douglas, look at the things he had to overcome. Number one, he was the underdog. For any fighter, that is psychologically a big thing to have to deal with, to be seen as a loser before the fight has even begun. So James Buster Douglas had that to psychologically contend with. I believe his mother had just died. His wife was critically ill. These are all things that James Douglas had to contend with, and people seem to forget that. They sort of martyrise Tyson and forget the things that Douglas had to contend with. And what happened? Douglas won the fight. So you could say, oh, Tyson wasn't prepared on the night, etc., etc. Now, it's true, Douglas never quite capitalised on that. He never quite had major victories after that. But the bottom line is, a supposedly great fighter like Tyson shouldn't have been beaten by a supposedly average fighter like Douglas. So it just doesn't add up. Then, of course, you had the period where Tyson was in jail. Now, it would be unfair to sort of use that to say, well, he wasn't good at that time, because obviously he couldn't do anything about it. He was in jail. And this is another important factor, Tyson's life outside the ring. And this is not meant to be a moral judgment on the man, but it was a huge distraction from his career. I believe had he not had all the distractions outside the ring, maybe he could have capitalised a lot more. But in the end of the day, what you have is what actually happened. So even if people use that as an excuse, saying he had all these distractions, legal problems, etc., that may be unfair, but you know what? There's many fighters in the sport of boxing in its history that have had to deal with issues outside the ring. Let's not pretend Tyson was the only one. To his credit, he regained his heavyweight title from Frank Bruno and Bruce Seldon in bouts in 1996, but he lost twice to Evander Holyfield, who is a greater fighter and who far too often is ranked lower than Tyson. I think that's unfair. He lost to Lennox Lewis in 2002. Now, people will say Tyson was past his best then. Maybe that's true, but you know, it's not a case that he was fighting a young kid. Lennox Lewis is actually a year older than Tyson. Some would say Lewis ducked Tyson. I don't know if that's a fair statement, but the fact of the matter is Lewis beat Tyson, and convincingly so. His last fight he was beaten by Kevin McBride. Now, fair enough, at that point you could argue Tyson was well past his best, and he wasn't the same fighter as he was in the late 80s. But what I want to get through here is, when you think about it, with the exception of Larry Holmes, Tyson never actually beat any exceptional fighter. Now, I'm not saying that to disrespect any man that he did beat. You know, the likes of Michael Spinks, Pinklon Thomas, all those guys were good fighters, but none of them were exceptionally good fighters. And in my line of thinking, to be an outstanding exceptional fighter, you need to be another outstanding exceptional fighter. So when people say Tyson's the greatest boxer that ever lived, it's rubbish. He isn't on the same level as a Joe Louis or a Sugar Ray Robinson or a Muhammad Ali or even a Rocky Marciano. I don't think he's on the same level. He is a great fighter. He does deserve the epithet of great. But exceptionally great? No, I question that. And I think it's true that he was very dominant in the late 80s, but let's not exaggerate Mike Tyson. You know, people act like he's sort of a robot or a Superman that could never ever be hurt or defeated. Well, the Douglas fight proved that wrong. So I think there's sort of this almost a personality cult around Mike Tyson, whereby if you say anything against him, the fans throw their dummy out of their cot. They have a tantrum. I take nothing away from Mike Tyson. Hell, he would destroy me in seconds. He's a ferocious and very powerful fighter. In terms of his personality, well, and people say that's not relevant, but because of his fame, I think it is relevant. Because he is an icon of the sport, so I think it is relevant to talk about that. Mike Tyson is clearly a deeply troubled man who is now trying his best to find inner peace and move on. And I respect him for that, and I hope he does. I hope he does find inner peace. But I also get fed up with his supporters acting like he's some sort of saint. Or maybe not that, but they do martyrise him, and they do take away the fact that this man, by his own admission, has done some pretty terrible things. So I'm not talking about Desiree Washington. I'm talking about some of his behaviour in the ring, which was utterly unsportsmanlike. There's no excuses for that. The bite fight, there's no excuses for what he'd done. I'm not saying Holyfield's the cleanest fighter around either, but Tyson's antics, his attitude, his behaviour towards opponents on far too many occasions, as far as I'm concerned, that has to take credit away from him. It sort of gives him an image, it sort of gives him a controversial image, almost like a freak show. And I apologise for using that term, but I'm trying to think of something that highlights the point I'm trying to make here. So in conclusion, if you're a Tyson fan, consider the points I've made. Tyson's a great fighter. I'm not saying he isn't a great fighter, but what I'm saying is he is not exceptionally great. When you really look at his record, and you really look at some of the guys he fought, no disrespect to them, but Pinklon Thomas is not a Joe Louis or an Archie Moore or a Wiley Pep. So those are the facts. And that then goes hand in hand that the guys that beat him probably deserve far more credit, especially Lennox Lewis. I think Lennox Lewis is hugely underestimated, actually, when it comes to pound for pound rankings. He's not top 10, but I think Lewis certainly deserves a much higher position. I mean, Lennox Lewis is, often it's said Rocky Marciano's the only heavyweight to retire undefeated. Technically that's true, but Lennox Lewis avenged his only losses, so Lewis deserves a lot of credit. He is a great heavyweight, and certainly the greatest British heavyweight. Yeah, so this personality cult around Mike Tyson, I think in some ways needs to be revised, because whilst he is great, he is not exceptionally great. And I think people often make the mistake of thinking that a boxer's fame equates to how good they are. There's many great fighters. I mean, how many films have been made about Willie Pep, or songs made about Willie Pep for that matter? That's my point. You get great fighters who don't really get the sort of attention and popular culture that they deserve. Tyson got a huge amount of attention and popular culture, but that doesn't necessarily, it shouldn't act as a testament to what his record was.